Hey, what's going on YouTube? It's Pastor Matt back again for another daily dose of defense. Now, I know I said I was going to talk about Paul and his conversion today, but I felt a more pressing need. Jude in Jude 3 writes, "Beloved, while I was making every effort to write to you about our common salvation, I felt the necessity to write to you appealing that you contend earnestly for the faith which was once for all handed down to the saints." Now, I feel that this has been attacked a lot lately, both on the internet and in other places, especially with this quarantine going on, where churches aren't meeting together in large buildings. But the question is what was the faith that was handed down? What did the first century, second century church look like? Now, yes, some did meet in large buildings, the synagogues, but as it became more and more illegal, most of them would go to hideouts. They would have smaller services within homes of friends or family. They were largely familial gatherings. So what I want to talk about today is, what did that early church look like? How did they represent what would become the church? And how did they worship? What did their service look like? How long was it? What were they doing that whole time? So I want to talk about, when did they worship? What did the early church look like? And how did they worship? So the when, the what, and the how. So the when, a man named Ignatius of Antioch, writing in about 107, he was writing that on the first day of the week would be when Christians would meet. Now, this stems from the fact that the early believers were busy meeting in the synagogue on Saturdays or on the Sabbath. So they would meet on Sunday, when they would travel to and from a central meeting location. And he draws this out of Colossians 2, verses 16 and 17, and it says, "Therefore no one is to act as your judge in regard to food or drink, or in respect to festival or a new moon or a Sabbath day, things which are a mere shadow of what is to come, but the substance belongs to Christ." Right? So what he's getting at here, and what he's drawing out of that, is that there's no longer this requirement for a specific Sabbath day. That the Sabbath was kind of moving as it was necessary so that believers could meet. And they did end up landing on a Sunday as being that day that they would worship Christ. It matching with the day of the resurrection, as well as a couple of the times when Jesus would enter the homes after his resurrection. So Pliny, writing to Emperor Trajan, he says they were accustomed to meet on a fixed day before dawn and sing responsively a hymn to Christ as to God, and to bind themselves by oath not to some crime, but not to commit fraud, theft, or adultery, not to falsify their trust, nor to refuse to return a trust when called upon to do so. When this was over, it was their custom to depart, to assemble again to partake of food, but ordinary and innocent food. Right, so Pliny, he's saying, hey, this is what the Christians are reporting that they do. He's not a Christian fan. He's not a fan of Christians. He's not a Christian himself. He's merely reporting to the emperor what he has seen with the Christians. And the emperor replies back to him and says, yeah, I kind of get what these Christians are. Let's not seek them out, but only if they're brought into us, prosecute them. But what did it look like? What were the church fathers saying? What kind of things were drawing people into the church? Justin Martyr, in his first apology, says, "Since you were called pious and philosophers, guardians of justice and lovers of learning, pay attention and listen to my address. If you are indeed followers of learning, it will be clear. You have not come to flatter. We have not come to flatter you by this writing, nor please you by our address, but to beg that you pass judgment after an accurate and searching investigation. As for us, no evil can be done to us unless we are convicted as evildoers and proved to be wicked men. You can kill us, but you cannot hurt us." Right? So what he's saying is that Their faith is so steadfast, they're not going to turn back from Christ. They're going to maintain their faith and maintain going forward with it, and that you can kill them, but it doesn't hurt them, right? Paul says, for me to live is Christ and to die is gain. And Tertullian as well, he says, we are a body knit together as such, by a common religious profession, by unity of discipline, and by a bond of a common hope. We meet together as an assembly, that offering up prayer to God as with a united force, we may wrestle with him in our supplications. This strong exertion God delights in. We pray too for the emperors, for their ministers, and for all in authority, for the welfare of the world and the prevalence of peace, and the delay of the final consummation. We assemble to read our sacred writings, and with sacred words we nourish our faith. We animate our hope. We make our confidence more steadfast, and no less by calculations of God's precepts we confirm good habits. Right, so Tertullian here, he is in his apology, note that common word here, he's saying that this is what we do. This is what the church is about. This is what we're supposed to be about. We're supposed to be about, doing the work of God. We're supposed to be about prayer and supplications. He's talking about getting together, and what makes them Christians? They have a common religious profession, a unity of discipline, and a bond of common hope. Do we have that in the church today? Is that where we're trying to wrestle? Are we trying to get to a common hope? Right? That's what Jude's talking about in Jude 3, right? I wanted to write to you about our common salvation, right? What we have together. But I couldn't, because these bad things are popping into the church. Right? For the first 300 years, until Constantine legalized Christianity and churches moved into larger buildings, Christians typically met in homes. So for the first 300 years of our faith, Christians met in homes, small gatherings. That is until the Edict of Milan in 313, where it says, we're not going to prosecute Christians. We're not going to search them out. It's no longer illegal to be a Christian. At which point they were permitted to build buildings and worship in those buildings, having a common core group getting together. But the church saw its biggest percentage of growth when it was in homes. Clement of Alexandria, a church father, he wrote about worshiping together in homes. The Dora Europos Church, that's a private house church that's in Syria, that was uncovered in Syria. It was excavated in the 1930s. It was a small Christian meeting house in AD 232. It had one small room serving as a baptistry, and the rest of it was just a small home. So we see that Christians gathered together on a day of the week in homes before dawn so they wouldn't be sniffed out. Yet we're worried that large buildings aren't open. And what did a church service look like anyways? So a church service was about 3 hours long. The congregants were all standing. There were no musical instruments, and they observed the Lord's Supper every week. Right? So the first part of the service was open to 3 groups. It was open to the baptized believers, those who were called catechumen, who were unbaptized believers who were learning the faith prior to becoming baptized, and then there were those interested in learning of the Christian faith. Right? The second part of the service, which was for prayer in the Eucharist, was opened only to baptized believers. Now, the service, part 1 was called the Service of the Word, and it had an opening greeting by the bishop and a response, something like, "The Lord be with you," and then the congregation would say, "And be with your spirit." Right? Then there would be an Old Testament reading, a psalm or a hymn, which would be chanted or sung, a New Testament scripture reading, another psalm or hymn, another New Testament scripture reading, and then a sermon delivered by the bishop while he was seated. So the bishop would be seated, hanging out, delivering it, and the congregation would be standing for 3 hours. And then he would dismiss everybody but the baptized believers, and then they would do congregational prayers, the Lord's Supper, and then a benediction. So when we look at our church today, and we say, oh, I can't meet in my church building, that's not the church. Church, in the New Testament, the word is ecclesia. Ecclesia literally just means a gathering of like-minded people. The guilds within towns, the silversmith guild, the coppersmith guild, the leatherworking guild, the carpentry guild, they would meet together, and those meetings would be called an ecclesia. So it's a gathering of like-minded people. It's not a building. This has been a daily dose of defense. Thank you for listening, and God bless.